The final album of a dead rock legend was lost, corrupted by a noise no one could decode. The studio's genius producer was about to declare it worthless. But the old woman who cleaned the tapes looked at the sound wave and whispered, "That's not noise. That's his final song." She knew because the dead man was her son. To the young, brilliant sound engineers at Elysian Records, she was a relic. Eleanor Vance, a 70-year-old black woman who moved with the quiet, deliberate grace of someone who preferred the company of silence. Her official title was Chief Audio Archivist, but in a world of digital plugins and artificial intelligence, her job had been reduced to that of a glorified librarian, a caretaker for the miles of magnetic tape that slept in the climate-controlled basement vault. They saw her in her small, soundproofed room, surrounded by vintage reel-to-reel machines, a ghost in a simple cardigan, her hands, gnarled with age, still impossibly steady as she spliced brittle tape. They saw a woman out of time, a keeper of obsolete technology. They never suspected they were looking at Dr. Eleanor Vance, a pioneer in acoustic physics, the woman who had co-developed the very noise reduction algorithms their modern software was based on. A woman whose career had been shattered and her name scrubbed from the patents after she refused to let a powerful record executive use her technology to falsify audio evidence in a landmark trial. She had chosen obscurity over corruption, a quiet life in the analog shadows while the digital world she helped create moved on without her. The crisis began in the most famous and feared room at Elysian Records, Studio A, the Cathedral of Sound. It was the final listening session for the most anticipated album of the century. Echoes, the last recording of the reclusive rock legend, Julian Vance. Julian, a genius who had walked away from fame at the height of his career, had died in a tragic accident just weeks after delivering the master tapes. The album was his final testament, a work rumored to be so revolutionary it would redefine music. It was also a commercial goldmine worth an estimated $500 million. But the masterpiece was unlistenable. A strange, pervasive noise had corrupted every track. It wasn't a simple hiss or a hum. It was a complex, multi-layered distortion, a ghost in the machine that seemed to weave itself through the very fabric of the music. It was digital, yet it behaved with an organic, almost intelligent malevolence, resisting every attempt to remove it. At the center of the chaos was Alex Croft, the 32-year-old wunderkind producer and head of A&R. Alex was a man who believed technology was a god, and he was its high priest. He had built his reputation on his golden ears and his mastery of cutting-edge audio software. "Run the spectral analysis again," he commanded, his voice tight with a mixture of fury and disbelief. His team of young, award-winning engineers, the best in the business, hunched over their glowing consoles. "Use the AI denoising suite. Isolate the frequency bands. I want that distortion identified and surgically removed." But the machines had no answers. Every diagnostic came back with the same baffling result. The noise was not a separate layer of sound. It was an integral part of the audio waveform itself. To remove it would be to destroy the music. The data, for all intents and purposes, was lost. Down in the basement vault, Eleanor had been tasked with the menial job of preparing the original analog master tapes for permanent storage. As she carefully threaded the 2-inch tape onto the reel-to-reel machine for a final quality check, she listened through her vintage, high-fidelity headphones. The executives upstairs were focused on the corrupted digital files. They had all but forgotten about the original analog tapes, considering them little more than obsolete artifacts. She pressed play. The reels began to turn. The music flooded her ears, Julian's voice, his guitar, the familiar, heartbreaking melodies. And underneath it all, the noise. The same distortion that had baffled the digital wizards upstairs. But Eleanor heard something different. Her ears, trained by a lifetime of listening not just to sound, but to the silence between the sounds, detected a pattern. The distortion wasn't random. It had a rhythm, a cadence. It rose and fell with a strange, mathematical precision. It wasn't a flaw. It was a feature. Her breath caught in her throat. She pulled up the digital waveform on her own archaic computer, a visual representation of the sound. To Alex Croft's team, it looked like a corrupted file. To Eleanor, it looked like a language. A secret language she and her son had invented when he was a boy, a way of hiding messages in plain sight, a game born from her own work in acoustic steganography. The noise wasn't noise at all. It was a cipher, and the cipher was a song. A second, hidden album, woven into the very fabric of the first. It was Julian's true final testament, a secret gift for the one person in the world he knew would be able to hear it. His mother. She looked at the complex waveform, at the ghost of her son's final message, and felt a tremor of both profound love and cold, rising anger. The executives upstairs were about to discard her son's true masterpiece as a technical glitch. They were about to erase the most important part of his legacy out of sheer, arrogant ignorance. She knew she had to act, but to do so would be to step out of the shadows she had hidden in for 30 years. It would mean confronting the very industry that had tried to destroy her, and a new generation of powerful men who saw her as nothing more than an irrelevant old woman who belonged in the basement. The discovery of her son's hidden message was a key turning in a lock that had been rusted shut for 30 years. In that moment, sitting in the humming silence of her basement vault, Eleanor felt the ghosts of her past life stir. The scientist, the innovator, the mother, all the parts of herself she had carefully packed away, rose to the surface. The grief for her son was a fresh, sharp pain, but it was now mingled with a fierce, protective pride. He had left one final, brilliant puzzle for the world, a secret song meant only for her, and she would not let it be erased by the arrogant ignorance of the men upstairs. She knew she couldn't simply walk into Studio A and announce her discovery. They would laugh at her. The old archivist, rambling about secret songs and hidden languages, they would dismiss her as a grieving, senile old woman. Alex Croft, the boy genius with his faith in digital perfection, would never accept a truth that came from the analog world he so clearly disdained, especially not from a woman he barely knew existed. She needed to give them a clue, a breadcrumb of pure, undeniable science that would force them to question their own assumptions. She needed to speak to them in a language they couldn't ignore, the language of data. Her gaze fell upon the vintage reel-to-reel machine, its warm analog glow a comforting presence in the cold, digital world. The master tape was still threaded, a physical, tangible record of her son's work. The digital file was a copy, a ghost. The truth, she knew, was in the original. She spent the next several hours in a state of intense, focused analysis. She didn't just listen to the tape, she dissected it. She used an old, perfectly maintained oscilloscope to visualize the waveforms, not just of the music, but of the noise itself. The engineers upstairs, with their multi-million-dollar software, saw only a chaotic distortion. But Eleanor, with her deep knowledge of magnetic tape and signal processing, saw the truth. The noise wasn't just a pattern, it was a carrier signal. It had been embedded in the tape's bias current, a foundational electronic signal that is normally inaudible. Julian had modulated that current, turning the very electronic foundation of the tape into a second, hidden recording layer. It was a technique of staggering genius and complexity, a feat of acoustic steganography that was decades ahead of its time. She knew what she had to do. She pulled out a formal archival analysis report form, a relic of a time when her job involved more than just cataloging. With a steady hand, she began to write. She filled the page not with talk of secret songs, but with cold, hard data. Archivist's note, Master Tape JV 773, Echoes, she wrote. Analysis of the 2-inch analog master reveals a significant anomaly. A complex, modulated carrier signal has been detected, embedded within the 150 kHz bias current. This signal is not random noise. It displays a coherent, repeating mathematical structure consistent with an intentional data stream. The amplitude of this signal directly corresponds to the distortion present in the digital transfer. It is my professional assessment that this is not a recording flaw, but a deliberate, secondary layer of encrypted audio information. Further spectral analysis of the analog source is required. The language was precise, technical, and utterly out of character for a simple archivist. It was the language of a peer, a scientist. It was a quiet declaration of war. She finished the report, signed it with a simple, clear E. Vance, and placed it not in an interoffice envelope, but directly on top of the master tape reel inside its protective box. It was a message in a bottle, and she was sending it upstairs into the storm. The next morning, The atmosphere in Studio A was grim. Alex Croft, having exhausted every digital solution, had finally, reluctantly, called for the original analog masters. Maybe there was a flaw in the digital transfer, he muttered, the last desperate hope of a man who had run out of ideas. A junior engineer brought the heavy tape box into the studio. When he opened it, he found Eleanor's report lying on top of the reel. "Sir," he said, handing the single sheet of paper to Alex. The archivist left a note. Alex snatched the paper, ready to dismiss it as irrelevant nonsense. He read the first line and scoffed. He read the second, and his eyebrows drew together in a frown of confusion. By the time he finished, his arrogant smirk was gone, replaced by a look of profound, unsettled bewilderment. Bias current? Spectral analysis? Encrypted audio? He read aloud, the words feeling foreign and strange in his mouth. He looked at his team. What the hell is this? Is this a joke? One of his senior engineers, a man who had started his career in the analog era, took the report. He read it, his eyes widening slightly. "Alex," he said slowly, This is not the language of a librarian. Whoever wrote this understands signal physics on a very deep level. A carrier signal in the bias current. That's theoretically possible, but the complexity would be immense." Alex stared at the report, a conflict raging within him. His pride screamed that it was impossible, that the solution to his $500 million problem couldn't possibly come from the old woman in the basement. But his desperation and the undeniable scientific precision of the note whispered a different story. "It's a wild goose chase," he snapped, though his voice lacked its usual conviction. "But we're out of options." He pointed to a young, bright-eyed engineer named Ben. "You, take the analog tape, run a full spectral analysis. Do exactly what the note says. Humor the old woman. But if you're wasting my time, I'll have you personally cataloging every tape in that godforsaken basement for the next year." Ben nodded, taking the tape and Eleanor's report, and disappeared into a smaller analysis suite. For the next hour, Alex and the rest of the team continued their fruitless attempts to clean the digital files. Then, the door to the analysis suite opened. Ben stood in the doorway, his face pale, his eyes wide with a look of sheer, unadulterated awe. You're not going to believe this," he stammered, holding up a printout of a complex waveform. She was right. It's not noise. It's a perfect, structured, multi-layered signal. It's music. A whole other album, hidden inside the first one. And the complexity of the encryption. It's like nothing I've ever seen. It's beautiful. The studio fell silent. The team stared at the printout, at the ghost of a song that had been hiding in plain sight. Alex Croft felt a chill run down his spine. He looked from the waveform to the cryptic report still clutched in his hand. The key to his career, to his company's future, to the legacy of a dead rock legend, was not in his multi-million-dollar supercomputer. It was in the mind of the quiet, forgotten woman in the basement. "Get her," Alex said, his voice a hoarse whisper. "Get that archivist up here. Now." Of course, I will continue with the story, The Sound of Silence, ensuring this part is longer and more detailed to match the style you enjoy. My apologies again for the previous errors. Here is the third part of the story. Start of text file, part 3 of 5. Title, The Sound of Silence. The summons from Studio A felt like a declaration of war. The junior engineer, Ben, who came to fetch Eleanor from her basement sanctuary, was visibly trembling, his face a mixture of awe and terror. "Mr. Croft wants to see you," he said, his voice barely a whisper. He saw your report. He knows you were right." Eleanor simply nodded, her expression giving nothing away. She calmly finished cataloging the tape she was working on, her movements slow and deliberate, a stark contrast to the frantic energy radiating from the young man. She followed him to the executive elevator, a silent ghost ascending from the analog past into the digital present. The ride up was a journey through time. With each floor, she felt the weight of the 30 years she had spent in the shadows, the quiet life she had built to protect herself from the very world she was now about to confront. The atmosphere in Studio A was thick enough to taste. Alex Croft stood in the center of the room, the printout of the hidden waveform clutched in his hand like a smoking gun. His team of brilliant young engineers stood in a wide, silent circle, their faces a mixture of disbelief and a dawning, grudging respect. They no longer saw a simple archivist. They saw a sorceress who had conjured a miracle from their own machines. "You," Alex said as Eleanor entered, his voice stripped of its usual arrogant confidence, now raw and thin. "Explain this." He held up the waveform printout. "My team, with the most advanced software in the world, saw only noise. You with what? A magnifying glass and a hunch. You saw a song." "I did not see it," Eleanor said, her voice quiet but resonant in the perfectly soundproofed room. "I heard it. You and your team have forgotten how to listen. You look at music," she gestured to their massive, glowing computer screens, "but you no longer hear it. You see data, but you have lost the soul." Her words were a direct assault on their entire philosophy, and the engineers shifted uncomfortably. Alex, however, was too desperate to be offended. His pride had been shattered by the irrefutable proof of his own failure. How he pressed his voice a plea. The science behind it. Embedding a carrier signal in the bias current. "My senior engineer says it's theoretically possible, but the complexity is beyond anything he's ever encountered. How did you know to even look for it?" "Because," Eleanor said, and for the first time, she allowed a flicker of the brilliant scientist she had once been to show in her eyes. 30 years ago, I was the one who co-authored the original patent for multi-layered acoustic signal embedding. The technology that your modern software is a crude imitation of. My name was Dr. Eleanor Vance. Elysian Records bought the patent after they had me blacklisted, and then they buried my name so deeply in the archives that even I had forgotten it was there." The revelation landed in the room with the force of a physical blow. The senior engineer who had praised the report's author now stared at her, his face pale with a dawning, horrified recognition. He remembered the stories, the whispers from the old days of a brilliant, difficult woman who had been professionally erased. Alex felt a wave of vertigo. The very foundations of his world were crumbling. The technology he worshipped, the company he served, were all built on a history of theft and lies. And the woman they had relegated to the basement was the ghost of that history, come back to haunt them. "But even if that's true," he stammered, his mind reeling, "the encryption. Ben says it's a cipher of some kind. We can see the signal, but we can't decode it. It's just beautiful noise. We can't access the music." "That," Eleanor said, her voice softening as she thought of her son, "is because it is not a cipher meant for a machine. It is a language meant for a person. For me." She walked past the stunned producer and stood before the main console, looking at the complex, beautiful waveform of her son's final secret. "When my son, Julian, was a boy," she began, her voice a low, intimate murmur that drew everyone in the room closer. "We had a game. I was working on acoustic steganography, the science of hiding messages in sound. He was fascinated by it. We created our own language, a sonic cipher based on the harmonic frequencies of his favorite lullabies. It was a way for us to speak to each other in secret, a language of love hidden in a wave of sound." She reached out and touched the screen, her fingers tracing the glowing lines of the waveform. "This is not noise," she said, her voice thick with a mother's grief and pride. "This is a lullaby. It is the last story my son ever told. And he wrote it for me." The room was utterly silent. The $500 million commercial product on their screens had transformed into something else entirely, a sacred, final communication between a dead son and his long-lost mother. The engineers, who had been treating it as a technical problem, now looked at the screen with a new, profound reverence. Alex Croft felt a shame so deep it was nauseating. He had been trying to brute force his way into a mother's last goodbye. He, the man with the golden ears, had been deaf to the most beautiful sound in the world. Can you unlock it?" he asked, his voice now a humbled whisper. "Can you let us hear it?" Eleanor looked at him, at the young, arrogant man who was the living embodiment of the industry that had destroyed her career and tried to erase her name. She saw the desperation in his eyes, the dawning realization of his own profound ignorance. For 30 years, she had been powerless, a ghost in their machine. Now, she held all the cards. The key to their future, to her son's legacy, was locked in her memory, a place their technology could never reach. She had a choice. She could walk away, leaving them to their failure, a final, quiet act of revenge. Or she could step back into the light, reclaim her name, and give her son's final gift to the world. Yes, she said finally, her gaze unwavering. I can unlock it, but we will do it my way. Not with your cold, digital machines. We will do it with the warmth of the original tape. And you will listen, not as a producer, but as a student. Because my son has one final lesson to teach you all. Of course, I will continue with the story, The Sound of Silence, ensuring this part is longer and more detailed to match the style you enjoy. Here is the fourth part of the story. Start of text file, part 4 of 5. Title, The Sound of Silence. Eleanor's command transformed Studio A from a high-tech laboratory into a silent, reverent cathedral. Alex Croft, stripped of his usual arrogance, became a nervous acolyte. He ordered his team to power down the massive digital consoles, and for the first time in years, the room was free from the low, electronic hum of processing power. The only light came from the warm, amber glow of the vintage analog equipment that was now being brought to the center of the room. The young engineers, who could mix 100 digital tracks with their eyes closed, were clumsy and uncertain as they handled the heavy, unfamiliar reel-to-reel machine. They looked at it as if it were an ancient, mystical artifact. Not like that, Eleanor said, her voice quiet but firm as she stepped forward. You'll damage the transport mechanism. She took over, her gnarled hands moving with a practiced, intimate knowledge that was a form of art in itself. She cleaned the tape heads with a soft, lint-free cloth, demagnetized the recording path, and calibrated the tension with a series of minute-precise adjustments. It was a ritual, a slow, deliberate dance of preparation that the engineers watched with a mixture of fascination and shame. They were masters of the new world, but they were utterly ignorant of its foundations. The digital world is a world of copies, Eleanor said, not looking at them as she carefully threaded the precious master tape. It is loud, and it is brittle. The analog world is a world of origins. It is quiet, and it is deep. My son knew that. He built his secret in a place of depth, not of speed. She positioned her old oscilloscope next to Alex's state-of-the-art spectral analyzer, a bridge between two eras. The key to this cipher is not a password, she explained, her eyes on the oscilloscope's glowing green line. It is a melody, a lullaby my son wrote when he was 7. He has woven its harmonic signature into the bias current of this tape. We must find that signature first. It is the key that will unlock everything else. For the next hour, she worked in a state of intense concentration, a physician searching for a heartbeat. She played small, isolated sections of the tape, watching the waves dance on her oscilloscope. The engineers watched, mesmerized, as she translated the glowing lines into musical notes, humming the fragments under her breath. There, she said finally, a flicker of sad triumph in her eyes. She had found it. A simple, 5-note melody, the ghost of a child's lullaby, hidden in the electronic soul of the tape. She then turned to Alex's machines. With a quiet authority that left no room for argument, she instructed Ben, the bright-eyed young engineer, on how to build a custom digital filter based on the analog signal she had just identified. It was a complex, counterintuitive process, and Ben struggled to keep up with her instructions. You are thinking in straight lines, she told him gently. This is not about deleting a frequency. It is about inverting a wave. You must create a perfect mirror of the lullaby's harmonic structure, an anti-melody. When we play it against the noise, the two will cancel each other out, and the true signal will be revealed. It took another hour to build the filter. When it was ready, the tension in the room was a palpable thing. Alex Croft stood with his arms crossed, his face pale, his entire career hanging on the theories of a woman his industry had discarded 30 years ago. Eleanor took a deep breath. Now, she said, we will listen. She pressed play on the reel-to-reel machine. The familiar, beautiful music of the Echoes album filled the studio. Then, with a steady hand, she engaged the filter. The effect was instantaneous and breathtaking. The primary music seemed to melt away, and the harsh, chaotic noise was suddenly isolated, raw and loud. Then, as the anti-melody filter locked on, the noise began to change. The distortion softened, the chaotic frequencies began to align, and a new, impossible sound emerged from the speakers. It was music. It was a raw, stripped-down, achingly beautiful melody. It was Julian Vance's voice, not polished and produced, but raw and vulnerable, accompanied by a single acoustic guitar. It was a song of such profound sadness and beauty that it felt like an open wound. The engineers stared at the speakers, tears welling in their eyes. Alex Croft, the man of golden ears and platinum records, slowly sank into a chair, his face buried in his hands, utterly undone. They were listening to the sound of a man's soul breaking. One song bled into the next, a secret album of heartbreak and hope. It was a musical diary, a record of Julian's final years, his retreat from the world, his love, his pain. But as the final, heartbreaking song faded, Eleanor heard something else, something hidden even deeper. It was her son's voice, not singing, but speaking. A whisper, woven into the silence between the final notes. "Mom," the voice from the speakers whispered, a ghost in the machine. "If you are hearing this, it means I'm gone. And it means you have found my real final song. But there's more. I found something in the archives. Something about you. About why they really destroyed you." Eleanor felt her heart stop. Alex and the engineers stared at the speakers, their faces frozen in shock. "It was him, Mom," Julian's voice continued, a low, urgent whisper. "Marcus Thorne, the man who runs this company. He didn't just steal your patent. He used it to build his empire. He was stealing royalties from artists for years, using a modified version of your own technology to create clean master tapes while keeping the originals. He buried your name because you were the only one who could have exposed him. I found the original ledgers, the real master tapes. I have the proof." A cold, terrifying silence filled the studio. The secret album wasn't just a work of art. It was a dead man's evidence. "He found out I knew," Julian's voice whispered, the final words a chilling, posthumous accusation. "He called me. He told me to let the past die. My car. The brakes. It wasn't an accident, Mom. He killed me. The proof is in Vault 7, behind the analog masters. The key is the same as the song. The lullaby. Avenge me, Mom. Avenge yourself. Don't let him silence us again." The tape hissed into silence. The secret song was over. Eleanor stood motionless, the grief for her son now a cold, hard diamond of rage in her chest. She looked up, her eyes no longer the soft, sad eyes of a grieving mother, but the hard, brilliant eyes of a scientist who has just been presented with a final, terrible equation. She looked at Alex Croft. He was staring at her, his face ashen, the realization of what he was sitting on dawning on him. This wasn't just the musical discovery of the century. It was a corporate conspiracy that reached to the very top of his company. It was a confession of theft. It was an accusation of murder. The quiet archivist from the basement now held the power to burn Elysian Records to the ground. Of course, I will provide the fifth and final part of the story, the sound of silence, ensuring it is a substantial and detailed conclusion to the narrative. Here is the final part of the story. Start of text file, Part 5 of 5. Title, The Sound of Silence. The hiss of the analog tape was the only sound in the world. Julian's last, terrible words, "It wasn't an accident, Mom. He killed me," hung in the air of Studio A, a ghostly indictment that was more real than anything the living had said all day. The team of young engineers stood frozen, their faces ashen. They had come to work to mix a rock album. They had just become witnesses to an accusation of murder against the most powerful man in their industry. Alex Croft was on the floor, his head in his hands, not just from the shock, but from the crushing weight of his own complicity. He was the golden boy of Elysian Records, Marcus Thorne's hand-picked successor. His entire career, his entire identity, was tied to the man who had just been accused of killing the artist whose legacy was supposed to make him a legend. He felt a profound, soul-deep sickness. It was Eleanor who moved first. The grief that had shattered her moments before now began to crystallize into a cold, hard diamond of purpose. For 30 years, she had been a ghost, a silent victim of Marcus Thorne's ambition. He had stolen her career, her name, her legacy, and now she knew he had stolen her son. The time for hiding was over. The time for silence was over. She walked over to the reel-to-reel machine and carefully removed the master tape. She placed it back in its box, her movements slow and deliberate, a queen securing the crown jewels. Then she turned to Alex. "Get up," she said, her voice no longer the soft, hesitant whisper of an archivist, but the clear, commanding tone of a leader. Feeling sorry for yourself is a luxury we no longer have. Your boss is a thief and a murderer, and my son left us the evidence to prove it. The question is, what are you going to do about it? Alex looked up at her, his face a wreck of confusion and fear. Me? What can I do? He's everything. He owns this company. He owns me. He doesn't own the truth, Eleanor said, her gaze unwavering. And right now, we are the only two people in this building who know where to find it. My son said it was in Vault 7. He said the key was the lullaby. She looked at the young, broken man before her and saw not an enemy, but the only ally she had. I know the lock. You know the building. Are you going to help me? Or are you going to spend the rest of your life making records for a man who murdered your greatest artist? The choice was stark, absolute. Alex looked at the faces of his young engineers, who were watching him, waiting for his lead. He thought of Julian Vance's music, the raw, beautiful truth of it. And he thought of the cold, dead eyes of his boss, Marcus Thorne. He finally stood up, his body trembling, but his resolve hardening. Okay, he said, the word a quiet promise. Let's go to the vault. The journey back down to the basement was a descent into the heart of the conspiracy. Vault 7 was not part of the main archive. It was a separate, high-security chamber, hidden behind a reinforced steel door, a place Eleanor had never been allowed to enter. It was Thorne's private kingdom. The lock is a dual system, Alex whispered as they stood before the imposing door, flanked by Ben, the only engineer brave enough to join them. It requires a biometric handprint, Thorne's, and a digital passcode that randomizes every 60 seconds. He won't be needing his hand, Eleanor said, a cold fire in her eyes. She turned to Ben. The passcode generator. Is it on the building's main network? Yes, Ben said, his fingers already flying across the tablet he held. It's a closed loop, but it has to sync with the central server clock. I might be able to create a bypass, a momentary digital echo that could trick the system into accepting a false code. And the false code? Alex asked. Eleanor looked at the keypad. Is the lullaby, she said. She began to hum the simple, 5-note melody her son had written as a child. Ben, listening intently, translated the notes into their corresponding numerical frequencies. It was a desperate, impossible plan. For the next 20 minutes, which felt like an eternity, Ben worked frantically on his tablet, sweat beading on his forehead. Finally, he looked up, his face pale. Okay, he breathed. I've created a 10-second window. When I give the signal, you have to enter the code. If it doesn't work, it will work, Eleanor said with a certainty that calmed them all. My son designed it too. Now, Ben hissed. Eleanor's fingers, steady and sure, danced across the keypad, entering the 5-note sequence of the lullaby. For a heart-stopping moment, nothing happened. Then, with a heavy, satisfying thud, the magnetic locks on the steel door disengaged. They stepped inside. The vault was cold and dark. It was not filled with music, but with silence and secrets. Metal shelves stretched from floor to ceiling, but instead of tapes, they were filled with old, leather-bound accounting ledgers and rows of unlabeled hard drives. It was Marcus Thorne's secret history. The original masters, Eleanor whispered, pointing to a set of tape boxes that looked identical to the ones in her own archive. He kept them, the real ones. Alex picked up a ledger, its pages brittle with age. The columns of numbers told a clear, damning story, a 30-year conspiracy of stolen royalties, fake production costs, and laundered money. It was a work of pure, systematic evil. And this, Eleanor said, her voice catching as she pointed to a single, small, fireproof safe in the corner. This is what Julian wanted us to find. The safe had a simple, 5-digit keypad. Eleanor entered the lullaby sequence again. The safe clicked open. Inside was not a ledger, but a single, slim laptop. And a handwritten note from her son. Mom, the note read, "This is Thorne's personal laptop. It contains the original, unedited audio from his phone calls. The call he made to me is on here. The threat. It's all here. He thought he had erased it, but I made a backup. He never knew how much I learned from you. Use it. Burn him to the ground. I love you. Julian." As Alex took the laptop, the main vault door slammed shut behind them. The lights flickered on, and standing in the doorway, his face a mask of cold, reptilian fury, was Marcus Thorne. A touching family reunion, the CEO said, his voice a deadly calm. I must admit, I underestimated the boy. And I clearly underestimated you, Eleanor. A mistake I will not be making again. He held up a small remote. This vault is now on a complete lockdown. The air circulation will be cut off in 10 minutes. You can hand me that laptop and the ledgers, and I might consider letting you live. Alex looked at the steel door, then at the cold, merciless face of his boss. They were trapped, but Eleanor did not look afraid. She looked at the man who had destroyed her life and murdered her son, and she felt not fear, but a profound, liberating clarity. You are a man who has only ever understood noise, Marcus, she said, her voice ringing with a power he had never heard. The noise of money, the noise of power, the noise of your own lies. But my son and I, we always understood the power of silence. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small, vintage device, a high-frequency audio emitter she had used in her old lab. This vault is soundproofed, she said, but it is not signal-proof. And 30 years ago, I learned how to hide a message in a sound that no one can hear. She pressed a button. A high-pitched, inaudible signal flooded the vault. It was a simple, repeating tone, coded with an SOS and their exact location. Upstairs, in Studio A, the senior engineer who had recognized her name saw a single, strange spike appear on his spectral analyzer. A ghost in the machine. A signal from the past. He knew instantly what it was. He hit the silent alarm. Marcus Thorne lunged for the emitter, but it was too late. The sound of sirens began to wail in the distance, growing closer with each passing second. The ghost from the basement had sung her final, silent song. And this time, the whole world was listening. How many of our world's greatest treasures are dismissed as noise? And what truths might we uncover if we finally learn to listen to the silence? If this story of a mother's love and a son's final, secret song moved you, please like, subscribe, and share. You never know whose hidden voice you might help to amplify.